I would like to set the context of this race for resources. And by that, I mean I'd like to lay out for you the demand pressures that the world is facing right now in terms of commodities, and also talk a little bit about the supply availability of land, water, energy and minerals, and how that imbalance is shaping up. There are three key factors that are driving global demand for resources. And I'd like to start off by just talking about first one, which is something that we talk about a lot in economics, and this is the growth of the world population. As people are aware in this room, there are now about 7 billion people on the planet. The expectations are that by 2050, there will be 9 billion people on the planet, and as many as 10 billion by 2100. Now, what I really want to emphasize here is that we are living in a very, very unique time in the history of the world. This is a period where the population of the world has skyrocketed over the last several decades. So population, number one, is a big problem, a big driver in terms of commodity demand. The second big driver of commodity demand is population wealth. The world is becoming richer, and 88% of the world's population lives in the emerging world, and that's precisely where we're seeing massive increases in the world's population getting much richer. Expectations are that we will have approximately 3 billion new people in the world's middle class by 2030, which is not too far away, and a lot of those people will be coming from not just Asia, but also Africa and parts of Eastern Europe and South America. The third key aspect of this big push for demand for resources is urbanization. As I mentioned, almost 90% of the world's population lives in the emerging world. I'm sure in a sophisticated audience like this one, many of you will have been to some of the sprawling metropoles of the world like Mexico City or Lagos or Beijing, where populations are 12, 15 to 20 million people. And there is a very deliberate approach by many governments, the Chinese government included, to actually urbanize much more dramatically. And that's partly so that these governments can provide and deliver services such as healthcare and education to a more concentrated population. It's worth pointing out here that there is a political imperative for these countries to deliver economic growth. If you look across the emerging world, 60% of the population, 70% in some cases, is under the age of 24. They have to deliver economic growth and improvements in living standards, otherwise they will have a political crisis. Even with China's per capita income right now. So remember, people like to say, well, China is the second largest economy in the world now, which is true, and therefore it must be rich. On a per capita income basis, it's around number 100, which makes it even poorer than many, many of the African countries that you hear about. In fact, just based on the population, because there are about 1 billion people in Africa, there are more poor people in China than there are in Africa, more poor people in India than there are in Africa. The questions and the issues that the populations in China and India are dealing with are absolutely daunting. In terms of water shortages, not only is water, we talked about this, a big deal on a global scale. In China, it is a massive problem. Partly because of pollution, but partly because in terms of the world average, China falls far below the world average in terms of water available per person. Very serious problem, and to that extent, the Chinese government has actually been rerouting rivers. You can see that China's approach is quite multilateral. They've gone to different countries across the globe. They're engaging. They're being quite symbiotic. They're investing a lot of money in return for getting these resources. And it seems to work. There will be challenges, of course, but for now, it's broadly working. This is a very, very different approach from the approach the United States has tended to take to secure resources. The U.S. has tended to use military action, and I think that sort of approach has tended to be quite detrimental for everyone in the world. It seemed to work in past decades, but now there's a new suitor in town, and I think it's very important that the U.S. takes the lead and showing that we can sit around the table and negotiate deals. The U.S. has to be involved. It's still the leading economy in the world. It is still an important economy, and it's really important that the U.S. gets involved. The first one that you hear a lot of is this claim of neocolonialism. The Chinese are on a campaign to colonize certainly Africa, but maybe other parts of the world as well. And I think this is absolutely unfounded and actually rubbish. They have a massive problem at home. As I said already, spare a thought for the Chinese policymakers. They've got 1 billion people who are demanding better livelihoods. They've seen 300 million people's lives change in 30 years. They want some of that. So the notion that the Chinese would ignore that at home and start going out to try and colonize is just completely nonsense as far as I'm concerned. Developing countries increasingly feel like their issues are very different from what's happening in the West right now. And the implication of that is that you see that countries like China, India, Brazil are increasing the amount of reserves that they have. And it's almost an indirect way of delinking their dependency on these multilateral institutions. The sentiment is moving against a sort of globalized world, and I think there's much more protectionism happening across many different countries. But you're seeing that the emerging world is forming its own banks. Chinese are now using the renminbi to lend money to do swaps, and I think that's really there's a sub-story going on here where they're basically building these new relationships without the traditional institutions. The Chinese give you money, and in return they get access to your most important resource, whether it's a copper mine, it's a land or oil. Well, in the United States, they did the same thing. They gave you money, and in return, they got access to the most important resource in the United States, which is the American consumer. And it is a symbiotic thing. I know people tend to think, the Chinese are sort of in cahoots, in the sense that they can't break out of this. I think they are making big moves to try and water down their dependency on the United States. When you say, the U.S. had a very different, had an approach to Africa, had an approach to Brazil and elsewhere in the world, they did have an approach. The approach was wrong. I think the aid approach has never, in the history of the world, there's not a single country that's ever achieved economic growth and reduced poverty in a meaningful way by relying on aid. So it is the wrong policy. The policy is trade. The policy is foreign direct investment. The policy is capital markets. It's transparency. And those are the things that people want around the world. And so if the United States can change the tone, and not just the tone of places like Africa and Brazil, but change the tone towards China. I can't tell you how many times I've been to China and people say, we just wish the Americans would say something nice for once. It's like we're living in a globalized world. Let's work together. These are problems that we all face. $100 of oil. Let's try and solve these problems together. It's not going to be helpful to create these schisms.